Welcome everybody. Sharon, Tim, thanks for joining us again.
Pleasure.
How are you both? Like, what's news? What's going on?
I'm struggling. I'm really finding this coronavirus really difficult. I'm missing cafes, missing restaurants.
Yeah, come on.
I really need a haircut.
I'll cut it. I'll do it for you.
I'm missing
It's
people.
okay.
I'm missing cuddles. You did ask. How do you go?
Well, for being an introvert, I'm quite enjoying it, really. No, not really, but it's just a weird time. And instead of a lot of face-to-face, there's a lot of Zoom-to-Zoom conversations happening. But
Yeah, absolutely. Sure are.
And you?
Yeah, I'm itching to see some different people. Can't wait to have some different people at this table.
And we do have some different people coming.
No, we do. That was just a little slight dig, but it's definitely just a light-hearted joke. But we do. We've got starting a new series today, aren't we?
Yes.
Where we're talking about Jesus and how he's often quite different to what the narrative believes him to be. But more so, what would Jesus say about some of the conversations society is already having going on around us?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's going to be really, really cool. So today, what we're going to talk about is society is actually already having a bit of a conversation about sin, which is hilarious because they would never use that little three-letter word. I know my generation, if I use that word sin down at the footy club or soccer club or wherever, they'd chase me out of town. But they're talking about the sin of the church and specifically the sin of Cardinal George Pell. And a lot has been said over the media and on social media over the last couple of weeks. Tim, do you want to recapture and reframe some of that?
Just last week, I think it was Wednesday, that the High Court came and declared that Cardinal Pell was not guilty of the charges that he'd been actually charged with. And, of course, media has gone haywire over that, and everyone has a different opinion about that. And whether they're right or wrong, that's not the point. The point is that different people are having different opinions. And what's been really interesting is that Pell has made the comment that he actually believed that he was being tried, not so much because of what people said he did, but from what people thought the church as such had done. He actually thought it was the church that was being on trial.
That's the interesting part, isn't it? Like, it's not the narrative isn't just whether he's guilty or not, but rather it's the association of the entire church and the entire church's sin around child sexual abuse, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's fair enough. I suppose our culture's saying they want Christians and they want the church to behave in a certain way.
Absolutely, and fair enough.
And they're angry, disgusted, disappointed when the church doesn't behave and when Christians don't behave according to the moral code, when they sin. They don't like it.
That's right. So the fascinating thing is that the world is having a conversation about brokenness and they're using labels and trying to appropriate what consequence must be paid for your own brokenness and for the sin and the damage that you've caused upon others. But just as the world is pointing the finger at the church and asking them to get better, often the church is asking more of the world too. Isn't that right? Sharon, do you want to go there?
Yeah, so there's a whole discussion which I've struggled for many years for our culture to have, and that is that 1 in every 4 girls, 1 in every 6 boys, and 90-something% of children with disabilities will be sexually assaulted before the age of 18.
Yeah. Just horrific.
That's not all happening in the church.
No, the church doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it?
No. And so it's kind of like it's hard to get society to engage on that topic and to engage about their own sinfulness and their own, as a whole, our, I suppose, combined sin, our contribution to that problem, to have a discussion about it. I've never seen it as an election promise, we're going to eradicate sexual assault amongst children, we're going to advocate for children this election period.
Yeah.
So for me, there is this tension and I suppose too there's all these churches that are doing the right thing, just like there are people in our culture that are doing the right thing. But then in both segments, there are people who are doing the wrong thing. Yeah. So it's an interesting discussion about sin and judgment.
Absolutely. The thing that stood out to me as I've reflected on this issue, and especially over the past couple of weeks about this, is I was thinking back to my time at the prison, not as an inmate, but...
I used to love saying my son's in prison.
Oh, you've got no idea how many parents from youth group have come up and asked me if I went to prison because the kids have gone back and half told a story. But when I worked at the prison, right, something
Yeah, sure.
But something that was really, really fascinating was how I learned very quickly that it must be part of the human condition that we've got a hierarchy to our brokenness, and we've got a need to be able to decipher who sits where on the ladder. Because even in the maximum security units of the prison, where there's the worst of the worst, so to speak, like the most broken, so the murderers, the drug dealers, the arsonists, the thieves, all of that sort of stuff, they are still considered a class above the child sexual abusers. Like those child sexual abusers are still put into an isolated unit for their own protection, because even in prison, even in the maximum security, there's still this hierarchy, and there's still this finger pointing, there's still this labeling of your brokenness is worse than my own, which I just find absolutely fascinating.
It is very fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's reflective of culture, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the church is doing it to culture, where we're kind of pointing the finger and kind of saying certain things about culture and how we want culture to change. And then culture's doing the same back to church and to Christians and saying, I want you to change.
Yeah, it's finger pointing, isn't it?
It certainly is. Do you think that God has that same ranking that you talked about in prison?
I don't think so. I think he put in a separate sort of scale, so to speak, and so we might go there, hey? We might see what Jesus had to say about the matter, because the reason why we are here is to see what Jesus had to say about this conversation, isn't it? Sure. So we're going to talk about a story from Matthew, and it's a pretty hilarious story, a really funny story, but to be able to understand some of the context, Tim, maybe you can unpack for us what it was to be a tax collector in those times, just so we can understand the context of the story.
Okay, would not be good, Jono. Is that enough? No, back in those days, a tax collector really had two servants, and one was the conquering Roman force, if you like. Rome ruled Israel at the time. And the second was the people who came from that country but were in the ruling class, people like Herod and both the Romans and also the ruling class of the Jews were generally hated by the average Jew. And so the tax collector was actually someone who was employed by both of those two groups. And that made him a very, very hated person to begin with. But then take that even further, the tax collector would then be collecting tax for a number of different purposes, including the Roman government. And it generally meant that the average person would have paid over 50% of their income by way of tax. But then on top of that, the tax collector would take his own cut as well.
So you're telling me that the average person could have been spending nearly 3/4 of their wage in taxes.
That's true. And so when you had an impoverished people anyway, they were under such a heavy burden of taxation, a lot of it was corrupt, and it was going to governments that they hated and they wanted to overthrow. And so the tax collector was the ambassador of these governments. People just hated the tax collectors. They were untouchables.
So they were really oppressive.
Yeah.
Mean-spirited.
It almost sounds like the tax collectors were the gangsters of the mobs going around collecting the debts.
Well, it's about true, actually. Yeah, it's about true. They had the force of the Roman government behind them. Yeah. And so often they'd be guarded by Roman soldiers who would go and become the enforcers for them.
Wow.
Yuck. And in this story, there's also a group of people called Pharisees. Sharon, can you quickly mention who they were? So
they were the religious of the day. So they were like the pastors, the priests, the religious people.
Goody two shoes.
Yeah.
Sure. Cool.
Yeah. Who had nothing better to do with their time other than to go around and judge people and to assess how good they were and how much sin they'd committed and how much they needed to improve.
And back at that time too, the Pharisees were on a mission to try and make people holy without sin, to try and lift the standards, because they believed that the Messiah was one day going to come, but they didn't believe he was going to come until people got their act together.
Pointing fingers. All right, let's read this story. So it's in Matthew 9.
Yep.
So it says this. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Pretty incredible little story. Like, it's only a short little story there, but it's pretty incredible. First thing that stands out to me is that Jesus Jesus, he chose to go and sit and have dinner with the tax collectors and sinners. Like, what jumps out to you guys about that?
Well, one, I suppose they're at the table, which is something we can't do at the moment. Yeah, I just find it really interesting that you've got all that mix of people and that Jesus is actually choosing to associate himself with people who would be considered sinful or naughty or on the wrong side.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the tax collector would have been like the person that you point to and say, see that person over there? Don't go near him. He's undeserving, he's unclean, he's an untouchable. So that's exactly where Jesus went.
Which is surprising.
Yeah, to me, as I read that and as I hear that, I think of Jesus as being a friend of sinners.
Yeah.
I see him as going and caring more for the value of the person, looking past their sin. Like, he had an understanding that they're not bad people, there's just enemy is badness. Do you know what I mean? And so, for me, I think that narrative of Jesus is very different to the one that the world has.
That's right, and I think sometimes we don't actually understand why people do what they do. And Jesus is more interested in the person and getting to know them and their story rather than just about what they'd done. Sharon, I think you've got an interesting story about understanding more of a story about people.
Yeah, I think as I've wrestled with this story, I've kind of seen that one of the things we do when we label is that we stop hearing the story behind what's actually happening. I remember a number of years ago in Kids Paradise, it was a busy day, it was wet, it was rainy, and there was a bit of a queue with families wanting to go into Kids Paradise, and one particular mum had waited, I think, about 10 minutes to be able to go, and then when she finally got to being served, our staff member had to say, can you just wait a minute, I've just got to go. So this mum understandably got really irate and upset. This staff member, though, had to attend to a 3-year-old that had been found left alone in the car park.
No way.
So the review that went up was that we had poor service. Yeah. The story really was that we had this 3-year-old child who we weren't sure whether they'd been abandoned or whether they'd been neglected or whether they'd got lost, was out in the car park, and our staff members needed to attend to that situation. And also probably the staff member didn't know what they could and couldn't say to the public at that stage, in terms of confidentiality, all those kinds of things. So there was a story behind the label, but the review or the label just simply said poor service, when there's actually a story behind that. And I don't know, I've often found this with, people, sinfulness, often there's a story. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just pure evil and it's just pure naughtiness and there's no other word for it other than sin. Other times there's a real powerful story behind why somebody is doing what they're doing. And what I think I love about this story with Jesus is that he's not quick to go to that place of judgment, but he takes the time to sit, have a meal, to sit at the table, to sit across from somebody and say, I see you, so let's unpack your story. Let's unpack what's really going on here in your world.
So really people are often very, very unkind when they just focus on the label, aren't they?
They can be.
They can
be, yeah. Yep. I also think it boosts your own self-esteem.
Yeah.
So I know at times, because we all grapple. I grapple with judgment. I think we all have different groups in culture or society who we have an affinity for, and then there are some that just get underneath our skin. And I certainly have groups that get underneath my skin. And I think that it bolsters your self-esteem when you can point the finger and say, well, oh, gee, I'm glad I'm not like them.
Yeah.
It makes you feel better.
And when we point the finger, we're really distracting away from ourselves as well.
Yeah, and we're probably doing that sliding thing. We're trying to justify, well, I'm not as bad as that person over there, like you were saying in the jails. The murderers are probably going, well, at least I'm not as bad as that person who's sexually assaulted that child, when in actual fact, well, murder's murder.
Yeah, that's right.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think you're right. I think we, as humanity, we put people into the bad and the good scale, and into those two categories. But as I read this story, and especially as I read that last statement that Jesus made where he said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, I think Jesus changed the categories. I think by
Yeah.
coming and sitting with the sinners, he changed the categories. Instead of going from good and bad, he made the categories those who think they are righteous and those who know they are broken. Does that make sense? So there are those who think that they have got it all together, and those who know that they don't have it all together, but the common thread for both is that neither do.
Yeah.
That both of them are equally, have got their own brokenness going on inside of them. So therefore, how can you point the finger?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I look at that statement, I think of he desires mercy, like that's being open-hearted and showing compassion and showing love rather than sacrifice. And way back then, sacrifice is all about trying to be perfect because you go and make these different sacrifices to prove how good you were. And Jesus is saying that's not really what matters so much. What he wants is people to be open-hearted and kind and loving.
I think he's kind of saying we're all in it together, aren't we? Like I think he is saying you either think you're good, or you know that you're not, and you want to do something about it.
He's a friend of sinners.
So I think he's saying that we've all got a sin problem. It's just that whether we want to admit it and deal with it. And I think admitting and looking at that shadow side of yourself is really quite. It's really hard. It's much easier to stay at that superficial level rather than to sort of look at, well, what are all the reasons or what are the things that I might be doing that might be contributing to why somebody's doing something or acting some way or why I'm acting in a certain way. It's hard to do that inner soul-searching work, to look at your shadow side, I think.
I'd agree with that. So let's pull this back towards the conversation that society's having again.
Yeah.
So we've just read a story about how 2,000 years ago Jesus sat down at a table very much like this one. Yeah. And how at the table there were the righteous and the broken, and how there was all sorts of finger pointing going on at the table. But here in our world, 2,000 years later, there's a similar conversation going on where there's a similar amount of finger pointing. So if Jesus were present in our society today, like how would he step into this conversation? Not just about the child sexual abuse, but just the wider finger pointing that happens. What do you think would happen if Jesus were here?
Well, I think he would hear, say, if I'm representing the church to the culture, he would hear me saying, we have a real problem. We have 1 in every 4 girls, 1 in every 6 boys, 90-something% children with disabilities being sexually assaulted. He would hear that. He would also hear the culture saying to the church, it's not good enough that you guys are sexually assaulting children. It's not good enough, church. Stop it. So I'd hear the 2 finger pointing, but I think he would sit down and I think he would say to both parties, there's a problem.
Yeah.
There's a big problem called sin, and in that he says it's not the healthy
who need a doctor,
but the sick. And I think he would sit and he would say, if you want to sit down and understand the sickness, the brokenness, the impact of sin on your own individual life, then let's have that conversation, because I'm here to help you with that. Because he's kind of positioning himself as the doctor, the physician, isn't he?
Yes.
And he's kind of going, I have answers to these problems if you'll sit down and have an honest conversation. But I can't do that whilst you're finger pointing, and I can't do that while you're denying your own sinfulness. Is that kind of...
Yeah,
I think
that's good. I think also, and that's carrying on from that too, is the fact that he doesn't grade sin. And we, as you said, we're very, very quick to point the finger at other people, but there's not one sin that didn't result in Jesus going to the cross. And so whether it was what we might call a minor sin or a major sin, a sin is still sin, and that's a problem. And
I think it's hard, isn't it, though, because some sins do
cause more damage.
They do, definitely.
Because we never sin in a vacuum, do we?
No.
Our sin always impacts. So I think it's hard because there's a lot of brokenness, and that's the other part of the discussion with sin, is when we're just labelling, we don't hear that cry for mercy, that cry for compassion, that cry for love, because I think at the end of the day, it's only love that heals. It's nothing else that heals that broken heart but love, and I think that's what Jesus is showing in this story. He's basically sitting down saying, I'm love, and I'm here to help heal,
Yeah.
and I'm here to help on the inside.
And in essence, what sin is, the sin is when we're acting other than out of love for another person or out of love for God. When we're doing something which is opposite to that love, that's what sin is.
Yeah. It's a hard journey, though. I find it really hard. I think this thing, learning to love, is the hardest thing in the world.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that.
Really, really hard.
Yeah.
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 I think it's very easy to just point the finger and assign labels
Yes.
Yeah.
rather than... It's much easier to do that than to sit down with somebody that and when you don't like what they stand for or what they've done.
Or even
It's
if you
much
don't
easier.
like them as a person.
Yeah.
That's hard, but that's what love demands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus did. He was the
Yeah.
friend of sinners, hey? So just wrapping up a little bit with a few points of where to go from here. So like what we mentioned at the start, over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be unpacking what Jesus might have to say and who he is in some of the conversations that our society is already having. So the first thing I encourage everybody to do is just continue to tune in and watch and engage and continue to go on that journey of asking questions and just being curious, hoping to discover that there's more than just that one or two dimensions to Jesus that they might already know. And then secondly, Sharon, what can they do?
So the second thing is there might be somebody who you need to phone. Maybe there's somebody who you've been pointing fingers out at and judging, and maybe there's a conversation or a story that maybe you need to have with somebody.
Yeah,
Is
that's
there
great.
Somebody, because Jesus was certainly the friend of sinners.
He certainly was. And Tim?
And the third thing that you can do is, if you're interested in finding out more about who Jesus is and just going on that journey of discovery, just personal message for Paige, have a Tail Race community page, and we can look to engage with you and perhaps even go on a journey with you. We absolutely love it when people ask questions, and some of the questions we haven't even considered, but it's a fun journey of actually looking at those questions together.
Great. Well, I might just pray, and then we're going to go into a bit of an item, and otherwise we'll see them next week, but I might just pray. Father, I just want to thank you for your amazing son, Jesus, and I just thank you that he was the friend of sinners, that he is the friend of sinners. I just thank you that he looks past each of our brokenness and that he changes the categories from bad and good to everybody just needs a little bit of help. And I just pray that for us as individuals and for all of our wider community that are watching from home, I pray that we may each be able to go on a journey of discovering more of who you are, Jesus. And I just pray for this wider conversation that's happening around our nation, the wider climate of finger pointing. I just pray that there might be greater grace that comes over that. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone.